ROP is undertaking a statewide campaign called Building a People's Economy. And right now, this forum is part of that campaign because the initial effort of that campaign is really to do education in our own communities, to really build our economic literacy, to understand what's happening out there with the economy and in the world around us. The goal of forums like this are really to break it down and make it simple and digestible for us to understand what's going on, and to and then really more so than even that is to have a conversation with one another about how we're feeling the impacts of the economic crisis, because it isn't some academic reality. It's not just happening on Wall Street. Actually, it's ravaging our communities. Actually, it's taking its toll on every single town in this state and every single state in this country. And I think it's really important for us to talk with each other about what that looks like and what that means, because it's something that we're all facing together. And so we get to build community around that and get to come together to build power to change those systems. I'm going to invite Dan Leahy up right now. He is a longtime friend of the Rural Organizing Project, and he's a former professor at Evergreen State College up in Olympia, and now is a student of social movements and a lifelong activist. So thank you so much, Dan, for being here.
You're welcome. I went, as soon as the wall came down, I went over to check things out, in Berlin. And I met a friend who was on a scholarship from Sweden or something. And we went into East Berlin. And my friend was a very famous, at least I think was famous political science professor, a very smart guy. And we were sitting in an East Berlin restaurant, and they sit you, there with other people, So the other people were West Germans. And they were, kind of acting snooty toward us. And they said to us that same question. What was the question? Yeah, what do you actually make over there in the United States? And my friend says, we make dreams. Right? And making dreams was a part of what the financial meltdown was about, right? It was about the dream of free money. I was on a bus going back to the airport in Boise, and the three women on the bus with me were competing to tell me which state had the highest unemployment rate. Everybody actually knows this stuff. They know how difficult a situation they're in. But when we think about the unemployment rate, I think it's really important to also remember there used to be this thing called a subemployment rate. And that, counted everyone who was in fact underemployed, in other words, those people willing to work full-time but can't find it. And it also used to count people that worked full-time and still had poverty wages. So you add that to 12% in Oregon, and you've got at least double that. The other thing is about housing. Household net worth, it's dropped 20% based upon stocks dropping and based upon the value of homes dropping. Everybody knows about the TARP question, right? The $700 billion. We learned that one, right? Hank Paulson, former CEO of Goldman Sachs, walks into Congress masquerading as the U.S. Treasury Secretary and asks for $700 billion. And he doesn't want any judicial review, and he doesn't want any accounting of it. He says, if you don't give me the $700 billion, the whole system's going to collapse. And what I'm going to do with that money is I'm going to buy up all those toxic assets that are causing problems. And then, of course, he realizes that he can't buy up all those toxic assets. So what he does is he starts giving that money out in capital to about 600 banks nationwide. About 83% of that money actually went to 20 banks. Here in Oregon, 3 of your banks got $282 million. In my state, 16 banks got $1 billion. Have you seen the effect of that anywhere? Anywhere? I haven't. I actually got interested in the question of the $700 billion because supposedly it was being done in the name of the American homeowner that was faced with foreclosure. But frankly, I couldn't find any way in which that money went anywhere to help anybody facing foreclosure. So despite that $700 billion, we're still in a jam. But that $700 billion isn't even what was given out. The FDIC, $1.7 trillion. The Federal Reserve, $2.2 trillion. So in fact, if you combine the TARP money, FDIC outlays, loans and loan guarantees, and the Federal Reserve, it's something like $4.3 trillion has been given out to basically the institutions that put us in this situation. And yet, they still aren't able to price those toxic assets, and they're not able to continue to tell us that any of that money is being returned or that, in fact, anything is stabilized. In the 1970s, there was a series of shocks to the post-World War II economic order, and those shocks created a decline in the rate of profit. And what were some of those shocks? There was a legitimacy shock. That basically was because there was a whole bunch of people that had been left out of the post-World War II deal. And they wanted in. The civil rights movement said, you know, this is a racist system. We want to be counted. And that sparked movements for the people of color throughout the country, right? Not only the civil rights movement, the movement of La Raza Unida in the Southwest, the Young Patriots in Chicago, the Young Lords in New York. There was this whole demand for inclusion in what is called America. So there was a question of legitimacy, whether or not the United States, in fact, was what it said it was, which was a legitimate popular democracy that represented the majority of the people. There was also a crisis of oil. During the 1970s, there were two major oil price hikes as a result of the Arab oil embargo. That sent shockwaves to a system that's dependent upon cheap oil. Then there was a shock of economic competition, because despite our mass manufacturing base and our military alliances, we're being outcompeted during that time by the European Union in the West and Japan in the East. And then finally there was a shock to our military dominance when we lost the war in Vietnam. So there was a series of shocks during the 1970s, and when we come around to the 1980s, there was an alignment of the political will of the Business Roundtable, which is made up of the chief executive officers, the largest 200 publicly held corporations in the United States, and the Reagan Authority. Those two things meshed in 1980, and there was several things that happened as a result of that meshing, and I call that basically restructuring of the deal. So what did they do first? The first thing they did was they dismantled what the system was post-World War II. So what did they do? They attacked unions. The Business Roundtable wrote manuals about how to take apart unions. And Ronald Reagan signaled that it was perfectly fine through when he fired the PATCO air traffic controllers in 1981. That was a signal from the chief executive that it was okay to attack unions. The second thing they did was they attacked the whole notion of regulation. And you've got to remember that when you attack the notion of regulation, you attack the possibility that there's a public interest, right? Because I was trained in public administration. What was my job? My job was to help regulate the economy or run public enterprises. And why could I do it? Because I was a professional that could see the public interest. There was this notion of a public interest attached to regulation. If you eliminate regulation, you eliminate the notion of a public interest. And slowly but surely we became a nation that said, hey, what do the big corporations want? We'll give it to them, because there is no public interest, right? So when they attacked, when they deregulated the economy, it wasn't just about getting more capital flow, right, or taking away our social income. It was also taking away the notion of a public interest. So what's the third thing they did? They attacked the notion of a social welfare floor, the idea that a citizen, once they're no longer in the productive economy, that they have a right to exist as a citizen. And so they came after the post-World War II deal. They attacked unions, the idea of regulation with public interest. They attacked the idea of a social welfare floor, and they came after, the public sector, public education being the main one. Once they did that, then what did they have to do? They had to regain all those things that they got from our wages, social income, from all that public sector stuff, and they had to, reconcentrate at the top, right? Because they were going to reorganize something. How did they do that? They did that with tax cuts. They reconcentrated that with tax cuts at the top, and then they put the tax burden at the bottom. How did they do that? They shifted to the state and local level. And what happens when you shift to the state and local level? You shift it to regressive taxation systems. So why are people angry about the tax system? They have a legitimate right to be angry. It's a regressive system. Our state, Washington State, is the most regressive system in the United States, dependent upon sales and property tax. So they basically, dismantled the post-World War II deal. They reconcentrated the wealth at the top, and then they decided to, go out and take it globally. So how did they take it globally?
It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause.
And that new world order was going to be made up not only of a particular form of military action, but it was going to be made up of trade agreements. And NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, right? 1994. The World Trade Organization, 1995. And then the push to have the free trade area of the Americas. That was supposed to be signed, in 1995. Still not signed. You know what those things were? Those things were financial service agreements. Why? Because the European Union and the United States are service export economies. And the thing that they export is financial services, right? They export insurance, credit cards, banking, all of that stuff. That's the way the United States and European Union makes its money. It doesn't make its money by selling other than financial services. So what did they need to do? They needed to go to the rest of the world, right? And they needed to say to them, we'll let a few of your textile in, some of your food, but we want every measure that prohibits foreign capital from coming in and dominating your financial services market to be removed. So those trade agreements, those were the mechanism for financial services to expand that market, go overseas, and that's why when we're talking about a financial crisis in the United States, and half of that toxic debt is in fact here, but the other half is global. You know why? Because we sold it globally, because we could. So two things. I'd say two more things about the global order. First, there was a trade agreements that allowed financial services to go worldwide. The second thing was the derivatives market. These new types of derivatives that were, created by J.P. Morgan, basically. And there was a woman in the 1990s that was trying to say these financial derivatives need to be regulated. Her name was Brooksley Bourne, and she was the head of the Chicago commodities trading system, and she was commissioned, and she was trying to regulate those financial derivatives. And people like Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, and Alan Greenspan said, no, you can't. In fact, they passed a law saying that the Commodities Future Trading Commission could not, in fact, regulate financial derivatives. The other thing that they did at the end of the 1990s and was signed by President Clinton that made this global effort possible was the end of the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act was an act passed in 1933 as a part of the Roosevelt-era reconstructing of the economy. And it basically said that commercial banks have to be separate than investment banks. That commercial banks have to be a part of paying attention to their own investors and to their depositors, and they couldn't get into risky speculation and securities and the rest. In 1999, they eliminated that act. And it was signed by Bill Clinton, and right after that, Citicorp began, the largest commercial bank, began to trade in mortgage-backed securities and collateral debt obligations and all of those things that got them and us into trouble. They went in there with all these different types of liar loans, is what they're called, negative interest loans. They convinced people through creative financing that they could buy something that they couldn't. And why did they do that? Because they weren't selling the purchase of a home. They were selling the ability to refinance, right? It wasn't the purchase of a home that people were buying. They were buying the notion that that housing price was going to continue to go up and that they would be able to refinance and get out of those onerous agreements that they signed if they understood them. And most of the people that I know didn't understand what they were in fact signing. So what happens is this housing bubble begins, and then the way that not only people who were buying the houses were into refinancing, but the banks themselves were into refinancing. So they would bundle those mortgages, right, and then they would sell mortgage-backed securities, and then somebody else would bring mortgages, credit cards, and student loans, and they'd put those into collateral debt obligations, and then they go to AIG, and for a fee, they get it all rated AAA, and get insurance and all that stuff. So what happens? People begin to be unable to pay the things they signed up for. Defaults begin, foreclosures begin, housing prices flatten, and when housing prices flatten and people stop paying on some of those types of mortgages, what kicks in is those collateral debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities, they trigger into the insurance. And AIG says, oh, damn, we collected those fees from you, but we really didn't save any money on the side to pay in case there was a problem, right? That's literally what happened. And so what does Tim Geithner do, the current Treasury Secretary? He's the New York Reserve Bank president. He gives $86 or $87 billion to AIG to see, well, that'll probably settle it. But of course, that doesn't settle it. And then Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Merrill Lynch, all of a sudden, they're all in trouble. Why? Because no one knows the values of these things. And so there's this, incredible, what they call a credit freeze. I'm not thinking it's so much as a credit freeze, really, because really, what do they want us to do? I mean, we don't have our homes anymore. We bought something like $5 trillion worth of mortgage debt from 2000 to 2005. Something like 80% of all consumer spending came out of home loans during that same time period. I mean, we are maxed to the top in debt, and our wages are flat and our savings are low. So where do they expect us to get any money to buy anything? Really? I mean, they keep saying, God, go get some loans. I'm sorry, I think we're tired of that one, We're not going to do that one anymore. I spend a lot of time looking at American social movements. And, I love social movements because it shows American people standing up with their best voice and saying what type of democracy they want. So I look at them and I do my best to figure out how we could use the lessons that they have given us. And the first movement is, the last century, was the populist movement. It was a movement, that came out of the Southwest Texas. It reached all the way here to the west, of course. It reached to Oregon and Washington. I think some of the institutions in this state and my state you cannot explain without knowing populist history. But the populists were people who wanted a public finance system. They wanted a public finance system that was actually attached to providing credit for some type of socially productive economy. And they believed that, in fact, if you had a finance system attached to some type of socially productive economy, you could have a cooperative society. But in order to have that cooperative society, you had to have public ownership of infrastructure. Now, infrastructure changed. They wanted nationalization of the railroads. They wanted nationalization of the communication system. Here in Washington State and in Oregon State, we took over things like ports, port districts, because we thought it was important that when the farmers brought their goods to the port that somebody other than the railroads decide about the price. And then in the 1930s, we took over a lot of the energy questions because we believed that energy was the thing that created economy, and so the energy should be public. And in my state and some parts of your state, there are cooperatives, PUDs, and municipalities that do that, like the I think it's called Eugene Water and Electric Board. And by the way, I want to tell you that when I was fighting the construction of 5 nuclear power plants in Washington State, the board of Eugene was critical in stopping those plants because it was publicly elected and they had officials who could speak publicly about what they wanted to do about those plants. So the populist movement, I think, is really important because it speaks to finance. And as much as, I'm learning this stuff, just like you're learning this stuff, I think we have to spend some time coming up with some public financing model. A public financing model that, again, invests in socially productive things, that maybe uses our credit unions or local banks that we think are sound to make those investments. And even, having public enterprises is a part of that in some way. Those PUDs, those co-ops, those municipalities, maybe create new districts. Maybe there should be districts that, in fact, are about, some type of production for use, not for profit, which was the old slogan in the 1930s. So I think there's lots of lessons in the populist era that we could think about and learn from, and I hope that you'll, read some of that history. The Depression era, you know, when I was the head of the Labor Education and Research Center at the Evergreen State College, one of the very first things we did was we went out and found people who were actually in all of the social movements that we could find that helped shape Washington State. And I was talking to this one guy, and he said, I said to him, oh, you were out there implementing the New Deal, you know. And God, you know, his veins started coming out. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. He said, son, we weren't implementing the New Deal. We were creating the New Deal. And I think that's really important to think about, especially the situation we're in. Because, in fact, where did the New Deal come from? I mean, do you think that without Huey Long in the South saying share the wealth, that Roosevelt would have passed any wealth tax? Do you think that without a CIO demanding some type of regulation on corporate capital, right, there would have been any SEC created, there would have been any Glass-Steagall created, there would have been any National Labor Relations Board created, the Wagner Act created? None of those things would have happened without the CIO there. What do you think about the Social Security Act? I mean, Robert Townsend's movement, you know, for senior citizens, you know, income that came out of California. Without Robert Townsend's movement, I doubt we would have a Social Security Act in 1935. We wouldn't have had that. Post-World War II, there was this question, there's a couple of things about post-World War II. There was always the question of, could you have peace with the Soviet Union? I mean, there's got to be some notion about whether or not we can have peace in the world here. If, in fact, we can't have peace in the world, then, you know, really a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about isn't possible. But I think also there was a question about plant conversions after World War II because there was federal financing a lot of the shipyards in Portland and other things. There's a question of plant conversion. I mean, the last aspect of deindustrialization is happening before our eyes with Chrysler and GM. I mean, they're selling Chrysler to some guys over in Italy, and what are they doing with those 40,000 auto workers? They should be giving those plants to those auto workers. And we should be, you know, making things that are important to us, whether it's new forms, you know, new energy forms, new retooling, new trains, new light rail systems, whatever it was. By the way, you know, they wanted to do that after World War II. But anyhow, there's lots of lessons in post-World War II, including the fact that we have a right to participate in the economic decisions. It's not something out there. They want to think that economics is something out there. It's not. It's the way we live our lives. Vietnam era. You know, there's lots of things about the Vietnam era, but there was something about the Vietnam era I think that was really important, and that was this kind of like counterculture. And, you know, I think the counterculture was probably more threatening to U.S. capital than all of the other social movements. It was the idea that, in fact, you could have a relationship within the community not based on something other than consumption. And the American people have, in fact, done exactly what Bush and the boys asked us to do. We went out and consumed and went into debt like crazy. And we did that because we didn't have the income and we didn't have the savings. And so we went into debt to do all those things, to buy our houses, to pay for our kids to go to school, take care of the elderly, cover health care costs. And when they went into debt to do that. But we cannot have an economy that's based on debt like that. We have to have an economy that produces income and savings that allows us to purchase things in some way. So I think there's lots of lessons about, you know, the construction of community rather than consumption based upon debt. And the final thing about globalization, you know, one of the things that's happening in December 5th is the 10-year anniversary of the Battle of Seattle. I had 70 students up there for 2 weeks. I only lost 4 to jail and got them out on Friday. But the thing about that is that those young people were telling the world that that system represented by the World Trade Organization was in fact an unsustainable, illegitimate system. And they were saying that in 1999. Some things to do. You know, I think you look at your history, and I think, frankly, the best history to look at is your populist history. Why? Maybe it's because I think of myself as a populist. Maybe because I really resent Eastern finance. And they were the last people that made Eastern finance their enemy and said, no, you can't exploit the Northwest, you're doing it. No, Stone and Webster, you can't come out here. Those American systems, you know, under the utilities, no, you can't come out here and have our energy. You can't have our ports. You can't have our schools. And I think there has to be, you know, some American voice that says that in some way. I mean, I think everyone knows, I think the bankers are like taking us to the cleaners, but I don't hear a national voice saying anything about it. I wish there was, but there's not. So what's that mean? That means the local voice have to speak first. And that's you folks in this room. The second thing I think is that, I mentioned this before, I think there's got to be a revival of the notion of a public. We did a study once about why some communities sell out their publicly owned system to a private utility companies and others don't. And we did, 3 sets in Florida, Iowa, and Louisiana. Every time a community voted to keep their publicly owned municipal electric system, you know why they did it? Because someone stood up and said, this is a public asset that's very important to us. So we have to have people that speak for the public and to the public about a public. I think we should think about moving our money to credit unions and local banks that we know. We can think about that. I think it might be a campaign that's worth thinking about. The State Investment Council here in Oregon, it invests your state money. They lost $18 billion last year. They do that a new prudent man rule. There's people that say that all that money that there is not invested in Oregon. I think you should go to some of those meetings and see whether or not they want to invest some of that money in Oregon. And I think you should think about a state bank. North Dakota, by the way, doesn't have a credit problem. Do you know that? They don't have a credit problem. They have $4 billion under management and no credit problem.
They have the lowest unemployment rate in the whole country.
They're a depository for all state collectibles, so they have a captive depository. And they have the lowest unemployment rate.
In the whole country.
And you know why they do that? Because that state bank invests back into North Dakota. It invests back into students. It's still doing student loans when everybody else is abandoning student loans. It invests in agriculture. It invests in economic enterprises, and it assists private banks in their loans. So you could think about the State Investment Council, using the bank as a depository in some way to build loans not only for local economic development, but to support private banks that are still viable. There's charts by city of the stimulus money. It was put out by the mayors in January of 2009. The U.S. Conference of Mayors, there's a list of every, shovel-ready stimulus project. But the thing is that it has to be about living wage jobs, or at least prevailing wage jobs. And it also has to be about making sure that whatever is used in those stimulus things is, in fact, manufactured here in the United States. I really appreciate the fact that this room is full, because as much as we need to reconstruct our economy, we really need to reconstruct the notion of a public. That the idea of a public is really important. That the public, in fact, can have its voice. That the public's voice is, in fact, superior to any corporate voice in our economy. And the public can have a vision. It can have its own institutions. It can have its own enterprises and own voice. And I think that's something that we have to construct as much as the construction of an economy, because that idea of a public has been under assault for the last 30 years as much as our particular economy that we developed after World War II. So I think it's really important that you're here, and I really hope that some of my comments are helpful and beneficial to your discussion.